Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this month's edition of Let's Talk Policy from the Kautilya School of Public Policy. I'm Anita Bhatia, joining from New York, and I'm delighted that I have with me today as my guest somebody who actually needs no introduction to all of you, Sonia Singh, the editorial anchor of NDTV, an extremely well-known TV journalist, somebody who started in journalism on television over 3 decades ago at a time when there were no private news channels in India. And today, of course, there are over 400. Someone who is now also a visiting fellow at the Cambridge Judge Business School, an international speaker, and a well-respected author. Sonia, welcome.
Thank you, Anita.
Great to have you with us, and I'd love to hear from you today about how political participation in India is changing. But to just set us up, let me share with you and the audience some numbers that have really stuck in my head from my time at the United Nations. So at the last UN General Assembly that I attended, which was in 2022, there were 193 member countries of the UN, and 30 or 31 of them had female heads of state who were visiting as part of their country delegations. And when we look at the data from organizations like Women Political Leaders, or from the Reykjavik Global Forum, or Global Women Leaders for Change, any of the institutions that track women's leadership and participation in politics as leaders, we see that, really the numbers are not yet at parity. And if you look at the number of parliamentarians worldwide, only 25% are women, even in 2024. Now, when you look at the women's vote, however, there's a slightly different story, because women are coming out in vast numbers to vote. And for example, here in the US, the number of women who vote has always been higher than the number of men who vote since, for the last 40 years. So there are two very different aspects to women's political participation. I'd like to hear your thoughts on both. Over to you.
Thank you, Anita. And of course, it's wonderful to be here with you today, because I know that in your previous role and also in your current avatar, you really tracked the whole women's movement. And as you pointed, the feminist future that India is looking at, and really the globe. I think for India, some of the data points you've raised are concerning, but I think also they don't tell the whole story. So I'd just like to go a little bit into the history of that. Now, if you go back to our freedom movement, now what was interesting then that you saw on the streets at that time, when India was, of course, a deeply conservative society, women taking part as much in the mass non-cooperation movements called by Mahatma Gandhi, called by freedom fighters, as men. They went to jail. They were out there agitating. They switched to khadi. They were very much equal participants. And I think that's a very major part of the reason why our constitution, unlike many Western constitutions where women had to fight for the right to vote and the suffragette movement, Indian women never had to go through that. Indian constitution guaranteed equal rights of voting to men and women. And in fact, given the fact that at the time we achieved independence, we're still deeply feudal, caste-ridden, religious conflict, the Indian constitution was remarkable in the fact that it really laid down equality as one of the key values that has remained unchallenged, and in fact has been one of the reasons I think Indian democracy has really flourished, despite many people at that time not giving it very long to survive. So fast forward to that given that Indian voters and Indian women especially had both equal rights to vote and participate from the time we became independent, why didn't we accelerate perhaps much more? And especially when you look at even the South Asia example, that Indian women participation, at least in parliament, is still behind, say, countries like Nepal. I think again, and I think Smriti Irani raised this in Davos, where there was a formal report came out which questioned women participation in governance. But guess what? They had overlooked women in Panchayati Raj. Now, I think, as you know as well, that 50% reservation in many states, after the women reservation came in the Panchayati Raj and local bodies in the 1990s, and then went up from 30% to 50% in a majority of our states, That's a huge pipeline of young women leaders. What we haven't capitalized on, and I think this is where political parties have a lot to answer for, that even though a pipeline was being created, and first generations often, we did have problems of, husbands calling the shots, or father-in-laws, or women often being just token rubber stamps. We are now in the second generations where you're seeing many, many young women grassroots leaders emerging from that pipeline. And I think that when we go into this remarkable law that has been passed, which either 2029 or the election after that, I hope 2029, we will have at least a leadership of young women who can step up to those positions. What I think has been a major stumbling block so far in India in women fighting elections has been, of course, the fact that there are still conservative aspects to it, but also the amount of money and the scale which is needed to fight elections. And that is where I think women leaders have often lost out, because you will often find that it's the most powerful who wins, or just the scale of campaigning needed. I mean, some of our constituencies in Uttar Pradesh are bigger than countries in Europe. So you have to also take all those factors into consideration. And I think the fact that the way Prime Minister Modi, and it was, I think, a very fitting thing that the first bill passed in the new parliament was the women's reservation bill, which is, of course, now law. I think the fact that it has now been made a law, we're going to see that acceleration of the impact of that very, very fast. I think that will really be the game changer for Indian democracy.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sonia, for laying out this panorama and reminding all of us and the audience that, the issue of women's participation in political life in India actually goes back to the independence movement. And you're absolutely right. When you look at those pictures, you see women marching on the streets and claiming their full role in not just the freedom struggle, but in everything that came afterwards. And it's worthwhile reminding our audience and viewers that, exactly as you said, women in India did not have to go through the suffragette battle, because it was, taken for granted that women would be part of political life and that women would have equal rights when it came to men, as men when it came to participation. So a couple of things that you pointed out that I wanted to just dig a little bit deeper on. First, I think you rightly point out, and I was at Davos, as were you, when we heard Minister Irani make the very important and fundamental point that looking at progress in India in terms of any kind of indicator had to take into account, which it did not at the time, the issue of participation at the local grassroots level. And I think what has been achieved in India at the panchayat level is something that is not very well known outside, actually. So I think it's very good that she raised it. I think it's very good that you raise it, and I'm sure you will raise it, and I hope you will raise it when you are at the Cambridge Judge Business School, because I think it is really important to disseminate this, because it should serve as an example to others and other countries who are seeking to increase women's participation at the local level. If it can be done in a deeply conservative country like India, it can be done anywhere. So, I think we need to get the word out on that. The second point I think that is very important is something you raised about the obligation of political parties to create a pipeline. And I'd love to hear from you, what more do you think can be done? Because you are absolutely right in saying that having the legal framework now, with the women's reservation bill now law, right? That is a huge step forward. And so you need that enabling environment to make representation happen. And Sonia, globally, there's a lot of discussion sometimes about whether or not you should have these kinds of affirmative action bills, whether you should or not make it mandatory, or should you just let it happen organically. And I believe that you cannot let it happen organically, because it will take very long, too long. We won't see enough change in our lifetimes. So you do need laws. So now we have the law. What happens next?
So I think that that really, in a sense, that I think this is an axiom true in politics, that often all people do good because they have to. Not only they may want to, but they'll only do good when they have to. And I think what happened here was the remarkable change we've seen in voting patterns as well. And I think that all astute politicians, and of course, Prime Minister Modi, I think, has raised the bar on that, has sensed that as an opportunity. So we saw that in 2019, for the first time, the number of women voting actually outnumbered men. And that, again, I think was a remarkable achievement, given the fact that just about 15 or 20 years ago, the numbers were lagging. The reason also because at that time, the sex ratio was also less than that as compared to males. So you had a lesser number of women voters and a lesser number registered. Now, Professor Shamika Ravi of the PM's Economic Advisory Council has made this point. That began to change when T.N. Seshan was in power. And the Election Commission really made a very concerted effort to increase women voter reservations. So in 2019, for the first time, we had women voters, I think, either outnumbering or just behind men. And I think in this election, you're going to see them remarkably outnumber men. In state elections, the recent 3 state elections, Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, Chhattisgarh, women did outnumber men. So I think in that sense, it's not just the BJP, but you've seen Prime Minister Modi talking of women as a vote bank. And that was a welcome change from, say, what the traditional definition of vote banks were almost like limited to a community. But here it's women across communities, which the Prime Minister talks about. You've seen the Congress, when they came to power in states like Telangana, offering similar schemes of free buses, AAP government offering free bus rides for women. So across the board, political parties have realized that they need to walk the talk when it comes to women voters. Because often, and again, this has been shown by CSDS and others, that women voters have made the difference between victory and defeat for a political party. So with that, the natural next step, though, of course, there's no correlation yet which shows that women will necessarily vote for women, is to look at bringing them into the democratic framework, not as recipients, not, as I said, as not just as Ladli Behnas, but actually as MPs, as ministers, as MLAs. And I think that once, as I said again, I think that would be the biggest change we're going to see in Indian democracy since independence, that when we see the face of parliament change with that 33% is going to be the next logical step, because you can't keep talking about women as, recipients of handouts without giving them an equal stake at the table. And I think that so far, at least, has shown that I think the recent elections, a study showed that women voters favored the BJP, but it seems clear that even when Nitish Kumar in 2016 introduced prohibition, it was introduced for women voters. So I think that you will see more and more that astute politicians and political leaders will realize that it just makes good sense to have women on the table now as ministers and MLAs and MPs as well.
Yeah, no, thank you for that, Sonia. I think you're right. People do good when they realize there's something in it for them as well. So whatever the motivations, as long as the outcomes are good and are pushing us towards a more equitable and just society, I think, the end does justify whatever the motivation.
No, and I'm sure the virtuous motivation as well, because I think there is also a legacy. Whenever we heard a prime minister talk on the Red Fort about menstruation or women's sanitation or toilets, these are things we all know, and especially you with your experience, Anita, almost disproportionately impact women. So, those are family good, but it's the women who really are the key beneficiaries and young children from this. So once that's part of political discourse, and, and we always used to come in India that, everybody talks about caste, religion, why aren't we talking about this? Now we're getting that and more. So, I just wanted to bring up this on development. I think one key mantra, which has been very, very good for a journalist like me to hear, and as I said, it's been 30 years now of covering Indian politics, has been women-led development. What does that mean? It means that the Prime Minister Awas Yojana, which is, of course, housing, is in the women head of the family. Now, I think all of us would have seen that. I mean, you can be from any strata of society, but usually it's been the male who's had the house. A woman can be thrown out overnight from a house she's helped build or been part of. Having it in a woman's name really gives you a sense of security, which is not tangible maybe in voting, but it has a much, much larger social good. So the Awas Yojana, you see Jan Dhan accounts of the poorest of the poor, over 70% are women's names now. So you straight away brought women into the formal financial mainstream. So these are welfare policies which actually are not just for women. They have a much larger social and national good. And we've seen this talk about women in the labor force, and we can come back to that, but it makes a huge economic impact, social good, which is not just good for women, but good for India.
Yeah, I think thank you for pointing that out, that, this willingness to speak about really touchy, sensitive topics like menstruation from the ramparts of the Red Fort, was a huge signal to the world that you have to remove the bias around some of these women's issues. And I think it's quite unusual because you do not usually see prime ministers, being willing to speak so openly about taboo subjects. So I think that was a very, very important signal to the rest of society that this is something that we need to acknowledge exists, not shove it under the carpet, and also that it is something that needs to be addressed as a matter of public policy and not something that is left to the private individual. So I think making it a public policy priority for a women's issue as a public policy priority was very important. I also think that what you said about this focus on financial inclusion is something that is worth discussing and disseminating a lot. I, during the pandemic, used to say to everybody, because we were desperate at the UN looking for examples of where countries were doing well in getting money into the hands of women. And, it was really hard to find concrete examples because the world was spending so much. The total fiscal stimulus that the whole world spent, when you looked at overall global spending on the stimulus packages during the pandemic, was $11 trillion. But very little of that money actually got into the hands of women. So when we looked around the globe for examples of where this was happening, India really stood out because, of the Jan Dhan accounts, because of the digital stack that India has, and because, 200 million women who got money could be counted. You couldn't really see this in other parts of the world as clearly. So I think this financial inclusion piece is also incredibly important, as you pointed out. Now, just coming back to this leadership question, one of the things that we who are really following gender equality and women's empowerment on a daily basis monitor is representation in cabinets. And when you look at all cabinets worldwide, I think there are 14, maybe 16, I have to look at the latest numbers, out of 193 member states of the United Nations that actually have gender equal cabinets. So that's a very small number, right? And then the other thing I want to say about this is that even when there are women who are ministers, very often they are the ministers not of things like defense, not of things like finance, right? So in fact, it's great that India has a female finance minister. And,
she was defense minister before that.
Who, exactly right. And who is one of the few female finance ministers in the world. You can count the numbers, on maybe 3 hands, not 2, maybe 3. So any thoughts on women in cabinet?
No, of course. In fact, I always think the dichotomy, I don't even remember, Anita, but I think it was in the US administration when you had the US Secretary of Defense and the US Secretary of State here. And at that time, you had Sushma Swaraj and Nirmala Sitharaman, who I think were external and defense. And the 2+2 dialogues, you had these 2 men in suits from the United States, and you had these 2 wonderful women in, very powerful women in Indian saris. And I think that contrast really stood out. And I just, just when you look at that perspective, and it's so interesting because, here we're talking about really women participation, etc. And in the US, there's still a battle over abortion rights, So I think that sometimes really the whole prism at which we look through what development or political participation is now really been turned on its head. I mean, as it were, and of course, going into elections again. And you see some of the most kind of sexist commentary coming from the US against women politicians who are actually standing. So I think when we talk about women participation, and this is of something, of course, I've seen in the media as well, that, of course, if you went in an ideal world, that if you had went just on merit, you may find that you'll have many, many more women coming ahead. You've seen this in the recent, say, IIS toppers or the recent engineering colleges, etc., that women may become first. What the problem always happens is when they reach mid-level, or say when they are being groomed as future leaders, when we see this abysmal dropout rate. So that is where we look at. So even for women politicians, so you get more MPs in, you get more, but it's again at the level when you need to lift them up to the next, where you need to look at how, one, make the person herself feel that she can do it, can deliver, is ready for it. And also the aspect of that, how do you differentiate between it being a quota appointment or somewhere where she actually has the power and the authenticity that she has earned it, because you have to be careful about tokenism as well. I think that has been varied because, of course, we've seen, where Sonia Gandhi was seen as the power behind the throne, a very strong woman. We've seen Mamata Banerjee, the only woman chief minister in India currently, which is a very bad statistic, but I think, very, very strong chief minister standing up. So I think that I would say that at cabinet level, you do have to feel that the person is there because they have earned that position, not because of gender. But yes, I think that when you have increased the pipeline or the supply, you will find that pool is much larger to choose from. But I think that is more a second generation part. But I think the first part we needed to fix was of actually getting people, women, into parliament or into the places where they could actually be elected. And I think actually Mamata Banerjee has a very good track record on that. I think with the latest Rajya Sabha nominations, 3 out of 4 were women. And she actually, yes, 3 out of 4 were women. And then actually she has given 40% of her current MPs, Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha, are women. And the BJD also, which is Naveen Patnaik, so it's not only about women choosing women, has over 30% of their MPs are women. So even without the women's reservation bill, they have really walked the talk in giving tickets, and they've had strong women politicians who have actually won. And again, Orissa and West Bengal are states which have a relatively higher scale of poverty, not as developed, but they've done very well on this parameter.
Do you see, Sonia, a difference between the different regions of India when it comes to how much women are pushed ahead and are being asked to run for office, or, just participation?
So it's kind of a mixed bag, because I have seen that even in some of the more educated states, like perhaps even Andhra Pradesh, Telangana, etc., they're very expensive to fight elections. So I do think that often becomes about it being, that often it's about how rich you can be to fight an election, and that sometimes favors men over women. And I've seen in states like Orissa and Bengal, etc., that often some of the profile of the candidates winning from there actually from really communities which are completely underrepresented. So it has been quite heartening to see that. You have had quite even in the current Lok Sabha, I'm not sure, there is quite a high proportion of women MPs from UP, Bihar, West Bengal. But I think, again, that has been maybe because some of them have been related to, say, powerful male political families and have come in. So it's kind of mixed. I think it's more in individual case stories, but it's not that there are more women MPs from a particular state, except, as I said, from Bengal and Orissa have both done well in that. And I think in that, it's perhaps because the money involved, or this thing has not been so much as it has been in the richer states. So I think that may, in fact, make it easier for women to fight and contest on a more level playing field.
Yeah. So just carrying on this topic of women participating in public life, one of the things that is raised a lot in many of the global fora is the issue of bias against women, and the issue of both conscious and unconscious bias. And how does this play out, for women in public life? And we have seen a number of really high-profile cases of women who've had to step down because of either family pressure or the pressure that they felt themselves, whether it was the Prime Minister of New Zealand, Sanna Marin in Finland. So, and when they do step down, there is a lot of commentary about, they couldn't cut it, and quite a lot of trolling and, really negative social media, which rises really to the level of harassment for some of these women in positions of power, which is something that men in power do not face as much. Any thoughts on that?
No, absolutely. And just saying that as a woman journalist as well, who's been in the public eye, it's true. Women journalists, the kind of abuse we face online is horrific. And especially some of my colleagues have faced almost like violent threats of rape or, physical violence. So it really is something which is, as when I say so, I'm sure also when you say women in public life, it's actually women in life. So one thing that I say in India, that one thing which has heartened me a lot is the visibility we are seeing suddenly of women in every field. So whether it is, I mean, we now have a woman head of the paramilitary forces, the CRPF, a first there. You have women, the Republic Day contingents, which were all women contingents or women leading contingents. I think until we normalize seeing women in leading positions, it can be in any aspect. It can be, as I said, a bus driver. It can be a taxi driver. It can be women in like sarpanches, of course. But once you normalize women in life, I think that is where you're going to be able to normalize the reactions to them much more. Of course, I mean, social media is toxic. It's toxic for men as well. But the kind of threat of physical violence or sexual violence is something which, unfortunately, women have had to face. I mean, we say public life, but we know that, of course, that for women, it's sadly become a part of life, whatever strata you're from, whether it's a domestic helper or whether it's something, this has just become part of life. And I think that acceptance is what we have to change. You're seeing more and more. I'm glad more people are speaking about it. But I think also that what we have to realize, and in this about when we talk about women in the labor force, I think the one disservice we have done is the fact that we haven't recognized that women are all around us in the labor force, but we don't count it as work. So for instance, the domestic help, just because they're not part of the formal economy, they're not counted as women workers, but they are. But they're given no rights. It's not, they're not paid by a check, or they're not part of they may have a Jan Dhan account, but in that sense, it's not given the dignity or the same workers' rights that they would have. Women at construction sites. So women are very much part of that workforce, but somehow policymakers seem to have closed their eyes to it because they're not the formal sector. As we know, the formal sector in India itself is just a percentage of what the much, much larger work sector or informal economy actually is. I think it's time for us to start looking at ways to recognize or count that also, because that work needs to be counted. I think you will find that the women labor force picture will change once you recognize that as productive, constructive labor, which is contributing to the economy of your country. Because, of course, many educated women who go out to work only can do so because they have a domestic help at home who will be working as well, but she's just not counted as work. So I think that's a very important aspect. And I think you can't hope to see the women in public life situation change unless the way women are treated in life changes. That's what I think the transition we're going through. And I think that's the transition that needs to be made. I mean, I'm glad that the rules against online harassment are now become quite strong. But I do think that we also have to realize that the offline harassment that happens is too often accepted as a part of life. So a major aspect of women at work has to be safety. So you must have safe public transport. It's all very well to have a metro, but if you don't have a way to get from the metro to your house, it's not safe, or you don't have adequate lighting, or you don't have adequate policing. So I think that those are aspects, and gender education in terms of equality of how men must treat women, and strict punishment if law is violated. So I think all those are aspects which will create a space for women to be more visible. As I said, a visibility factor is something which really must come about.
Yeah, I think you've touched on so many important points. One, you raised this issue of the violence against women. And, I think it would be great to hear your thoughts on what more can be done to reduce levels of violence against women in India, because it is, an important and really difficult issue. It is not something that has a silver bullet solution that you pass a law and, that's it. No. And look, this is true of many countries in the world where there is violence. But in India, it is a particular problem. So I do think we need to discuss a little bit, what more can be done, whether in the public sphere or the private sphere, to change this. Visibility is one thing, but what else can we do? I liked your idea of education. So, should we have special curricula on this? Should there be, more work done to create male allies who speak up about this? I think the role model point that you raised is very important, where there are now women in positions that you would not have seen women in before, like what you just raised on the reserve forces. Any position, untraditional, which is now occupied by a woman, helps. But digging a little deeper into this issue of violence against women, physical or online, what more can we do?
I think, I mean, education is, of course, a key factor. I think it touches also on this aspect of our demographic dividend. I mean, of course, India is now the most populous country in the world with extremely high young population. Now you have a young
Yeah.
population. Are they given, do they have enough employment opportunities, skilling opportunities? I think these are all very key to have a sense of a productive young workforce, which is what, of course, India is hitting that golden spot. But if we cannot utilize it, we all know what the fallout of that can be. So I think education is an absolutely key factor in how men must treat women, because too often the onus is on the young woman. But I think this has to be done also in a more infrastructural aspect. So, for instance, they're not just the big companies, but we're looking at SMEs, where I made that point of domestic help, but we made that point also that what are the safety measures which are available to women who go out to work. Now, in big corporations, we all have now, you'll have the POSH, which is the anti-sexual harassment committees that's mandated by the Supreme Court. So you say that you will have in bigger corporations, there will be many safety nets in place, but for 90% of women working, none of those exist. So how do you actually provide that? How do you also make the balance that if you make so many laws, no company will going to want to keep a woman, because they're going to say, for us, it just doesn't make sense to do all this. It's too much money, it's too much cost. So I think the government does need to step in here in terms of like almost funding, or looking at, like you had a CSR, that perhaps that 1% of it can go into not just for your company. Can we look at solutions which can make, say, more women work in another area? So for instance, if you're doing CSR mandate that so many women should be employed there or something, and look at it again, as I said, social good, because again, this is not about being nice to women, or this is not about, or this is something that is hypothetically the right thing to do. It's about being the smart thing to do. It's about being the economically important thing to do. The figures are better than me about whether it's the World Bank has talked about how much will be added to our GDP if just 50% of women are in the workforce. So this is the only thing India needs to do if you want to you want to become the third largest economy in the world, you want to be a developed country by 2047, you can't do it without women being equal participants of the workforce and in public life. Because of course, workforce is not just the corporate sector, but in every aspect. I mean, whether it's the military, whether it's the media, whether it's the politics, that's all work. So I think that is something which is absolutely key, that it has to have infrastructural support along with, as I said, a social mindset change. And we've seen that can work. I mean, whether it's from spiritual leaders, whether it's from, as I said, Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao, or take your selfie with your daughter. These are things which make a difference. And, it's often, it may be cynical to say, what does it make? It changes when you have Bollywood stars endorsing, or when you have, it's like destination weddings is a maybe trivial way to look at it. But, when they're doing it, everybody wants to do it. When it's suddenly something that is seen as the cool thing to do, or you have your influencers talking about this, it happens more and more. And as you know, financial independence suddenly gives women completely different status in the house. So, even if you're an influencer, I'm like, that's great because you're earning money for it. It just changes the way the whole family dynamic changes, and the respect a woman gets in the house as well. And I mean, just one aspect of that is when we look at the amazing rise of the self-help movement in India of women. I think that has been, especially in rural areas, a real game changer for how women have been seen and respected. So I think that is something which is going to be a real development. And as I said, that more and more women, we see how it becomes normal, women after dark, women in workplaces, women in buses. I think that is what will bring about the real change.
Yeah, no, thank you, Sonia. I think pointing out this issue of creating safe environments for women is really important, and creating the infrastructure, as you called it, of support for women to be in the workforce is very important. And here I just want to share with the audience, one important fact, which is that in many countries now, because people are recognizing that you have to recognize women's work, which is not counted as work, as real work. It's not employment, it's not paid, but it is still work. And that is the care burden. So this issue of the care burden is now something that actually came to light during the pandemic. You couldn't help but notice that, the woman was the one who was doing all the cooking, the cleaning, the managing, the children's homework when everybody was stuck at home during the pandemic. So in a few countries, notably Argentina, Uruguay, and I believe now Mexico, there is actually legislation on what is called the care burden. And this legislation is designed to make sure, first of all, that you acknowledge that this thing exists, because it's there, but it's not named, right? So the legislation is saying, actually, this is real. There is care work. And second, we are expecting government as well as the private sector to make provisions that takes into account a woman's care burden. So I want to share that because I think it's important for us to look at that and to see if that is something that needs to be pushed as a matter of public policy, and whether there should be specific legislation on care, in order to address this, because without naming it and without shaming everybody into wanting to do something about it, it's going to take a long time for it to change organically. So just for information out there. Then I want to pick up on this point that you made on companies, already trying to do something. So I like this idea that you were, I think, floating, that, they're doing 1% on CSR already. Maybe this can be more purposefully and more intentionally directed towards women's issues. And there are really basic things that people don't think about when it comes to taking a gender lens on things. For example, I'm thinking back to my days in IFC. When I was at the International Finance Corporation, one of our clients in India, really wanted to do the right thing. But one of the things they had overlooked was that in order to attract more women into the workforce, they actually needed to build separate toilets for women. So, sometimes very small things can be big game changers. Another company I was speaking to had not really factored in the huge positive, disproportionate impact they would have by having buses that would take care of taking their female workers back to neighboring, towns. So that touches on the issue of safety that you raised. So there are sometimes these small levers of change that can have huge impact. Any thoughts?
No, and in fact, I think many of these are also not women's issues, but human issues. So
Yes.
Naina Kidwai and I were in a conversation just last week, and she was talking about her experience when she was a chairperson of HSBC. And she actually asked her male managers, and because they were reporting to her that it was the first woman CEO, to say that I want you to go out and see that what make teams, like with some women representatives, what would make the women employees in the company work better or be more part, or she wanted to create a middle manager level, including women. So these male managers did, and what they found that this idea came from the women employees, saying that they were working 5.5 days. And they said, we don't mind if you extend the working day by, say, half an hour a day or whatever. But why don't we work 5 days? Because, it gives you a straight 2 days then to be with the family, to do the children's work, to, look after whatever the thing is, and do that. And when they came out with this proposal and gave it to Naina, she said it's actually a great idea, because why do we actually need to? You save on electricity, you save on transport, you save on many other things, water, etc. So she pitched it to their global bosses, and they were all a bit startled because, of course, HPSP has global standards. They said, why would you be 5 days? And she said, I'll prove it in productivity. And when they did it, it worked very well, not just for women, but for men too, who also should be taking more of the thing of spending time with family and various looking after parents, whatever other stuff, or just free time to spend with yourself. And it was such a success that HSBC then introduces globally. And it just came out of having a conversation. And as I said, women's conversations should not only be with women. Just having conversations with your managers, with employees, what do you think would make your working life and productivity better? Because also, of course, a happy employee is a more productive employee. So that was just one example she gave of how well that actually worked and just changed the whole work culture. So I think that's really a key thing for us to look at. I mean, when I was a young woman, young in my 30s, I remember when I was expecting my first child. So I said, I told my boss at that time, Pranay Radhika Roy, that I may quit. And this was now 20 years ago. And they were like, no, we'd set up a creche. And now, of course, it's mandated. But at that time, creches, that's just a simple thing, was still seen as such a rarity. And a lot of male fathers then wanted to start using the creche as well, because they had wives who were working too, and they didn't have a creche in their office. So I think if we look at it through a prism of human rights, so it can be X and Y come to you, and they both may have a male may have another issue. If you look at it as human issues, how do you make it the employee CEO corporation relationship better? You will find that it will cover both. They're not one gender, because now the working from home model, which is it's not only women who want to work from home or not. So that balance is to be hit for both. So I think that is really that if you look at it as a system of equality, it has to be something equal, but you have to recognize that equality, that there are certain groups who may need a little bit more of a bend in this situation, and another group may need a bend in this situation, or another individual, and then factor all those aspects in. And I think that really is key to looking at. I mean, again, our shuttle services are used by both men and women. So I think that is something which is key to looking at getting more women into the workplace specifically, but also making it a more productive workplace.
Yeah. So you pointed out a very important thing, which brings us back to sort of the heart of what we started talking about, which is political participation. The changing nature of political participation in India, which is really the changing nature of the role of women. This is what we have touched on in the last 40 minutes or so. And since you talked about this being everybody's issue, I want to conclude our talk today with just some data on what is happening to young men and boys all over the world, and how this is going to matter for political participation everywhere, not just in India, and to get your thoughts on the element of male allyship and the views of young men and boys. One of the things that has been picked up in this global index that is done every year, which looks at attitudes. So there is this firm called Kantar, which works to collect data on attitudes. And their latest attitudinal survey, which came out last year, and looked at, not all countries in the world, but a substantial number of them. One of the startling things that has come through in this attitudinal survey is that the attitudes of young men and boys towards women has changed. And it is now more negative in the age group 18 to 25 than it has been previously. And that this change is showing up in places like South Korea. It is influencing political participation. It is influencing political outcomes. And so there is more space in the world for anti-women views in some ways. And these young men are going out to vote, and they are voting for candidates who are openly anti-women. Mm-hmm. So, when we talk about the changing nature of political participation in India, how do you see the young men's vote and the male vote in India?
I think I think India is always, in some ways echoes some global attitudes, but I think in some ways it's also uniquely its own. So I think globally what's happening, you've seen this, that somehow with social media, the amplifying effect that has been provided to some of the worst elements in society, whether it is, as I said, anti-women attitudes, whether it is about, take the example of, say, Taylor Swift, or something, where you have so many people hating her for saying things you just say perfectly obvious. So I think the amplification of negativity is something which is a real problem in the world, and that's not limited to any countries. Of course, social media, its best and worst is amplified across the world. So of course, I think there's that impact in India as well. A recent survey I read, and I don't think it was a very large survey, but it said that how, at least in India, younger people, or at least younger men, are quite keen to marry a working woman. So I think that is an interesting shift, because of course we knew that earlier it was very much that if you get married, that means the end of your job. And I think the interesting thing was that a lot more younger men were saying that they would like to marry women who work. And I think some of the responses included that, there's some guarantee if I lose my job, etc. So I think it was nice to see that they thought that the wife could be the safety net. Of course, I don't know if they changed the fact that the wife would still be the one cooking, coming home and cleaning after a job. But yeah, it was a significant change, at least in terms of that. I do think that in India, that attitudes, and I think Pew Surveys recently has shown, are still conservative, that the majority of young people are still largely conservative. So I don't think in that sense that there would be anti-women as much as perhaps a more conservative way of looking at women, and, women as mothers, women as sisters, and perhaps then, they should take a secondary place to men, etc. But yeah, I think that is something which is still true socially. But I do think, and I think again, that this is quite remarkable, that political leaders across lines have now, by giving women such a focus in terms of power, a power shift almost in the home, and like we were talking earlier, I think that financial, for instance, cooking gas subsidies coming into the woman's account. When you have financial independence, I think it does really change the power roles in a sense in the equations in the household as well. So I think that has definitely, because now, I mean, look at the women's reservation bill, for example. I mean, I was a young journalist then when we were covering it, and we never thought we would see it as a reality. It was a lovely moment when women politicians, I remember Sushma Swaraj, Brinda Karat, and Najma Heptullah were hugging when it had passed that initial stage, and across, tears in their eyes, because I think they never thought, but the kind of backlash and the absolutely misogynistic, horrible rhetoric when it was being debated, which was in the House, we never thought I would see it passed. I mean, at least in my career. And then the way it went through so smoothly this time, I mean, there was no opposition to it. So that was for me, there was no opposition to it. The same male politicians from very conservative backgrounds. I mean, in some cases they weren't there, but their sons or their families didn't do a peep, because it was just not acceptable anymore to say that women should not get this right. I mean, it's really not a reservation, it was a right seen by many. And I think that was the biggest change in Indian political attitude that I've seen, because that was, I think they literally one MP opposed it out of over 500. So I think that is the attitude I'd like to hold on to, because I think no one anymore opposes the idea that Indian women's time has come for political participation. So as I said, for me, it's not, it may happen in 5 years, it may happen in 10 years, but you can't change it now. The president has signed it herself, of course, a woman who's battled extraordinary circumstances to make it to India's first citizen. So I think in that way, so as I said, I think India in many, many ways now is adopted its own, has its own attitude system, own value system. And I think that has a lot to teach the world.
Yes, it's interesting you say that, and we'll close on that note. But just saying, India's always had its own path. I remember when in the US, the first female CEO on Wall Street was appointed, and there was much rejoicing. This was in 2019. And I remember, sending a congratulatory note to her, but also sharing with my global colleagues that, I found it odd that in 2019 we were celebrating this on Wall Street when India, all the banks at that time, were run by women. So, it was not an extraordinary thing by any means, to have a woman running a major bank. But of course, on Wall Street, it was a big deal. Mm-hmm. So I do think you're right that there are these very particular things about India that make it forge its own path, where it will not necessarily reflect global patterns, whether good or bad. I want to conclude by just saying that I think I have come to the conclusion after years of working in this sphere that the whole issue of women's participation in any aspect of life is not just, and you said this, Sonia, and you said it very well before, is not just a woman's issue. This is really an all of society issue, because bringing benefits to women brings benefits to the family, to the community, to the country at large. And that's why there are these global estimates of, if you really unleash women's participation, whether in political life or any other aspect of life, you are really unleashing the power of the economy to grow and of society to become more prosperous, more just, and more inclusive. Your final concluding thoughts, Sonia?
Absolutely, Anita. So as I said, for me, it's always not been about women's rights, but human rights. I mean, women are 50% of humanity. So excluding or discrimination against women is a human rights issue. And I think that really is the point that all of us need to know. I'm looking forward eagerly to what the change in Indian politics will be with once this law actually comes into force. And I think we're going to see that playing out, because we're all smart political parties will start building up a leadership who can actually fight and contest. Because of course, also if it's rotating, you're going to have a different each time. So you can't just have the same set. I think the women's challenges and opportunities are unique to India. But I think it really has been extremely admirable to see that how much Indian women, and I say whether it's been sports, whether it's been the military, whether it's been in, or I mean, I think we just had a woman fencer who's made it to the Olympics. All kinds of different fields are really, really coming to the coming to the fore. So really, when we use the word Nari Shakti, and many political slogans can be very empty, but I think really the word Nari Shakti is something which is embodying a new India, a new women's force today, which is very, very heartening to see. And to all the young women and men watching this, I think it's not about one gender versus the other at all. It's really about how we are coming together to build a more prosperous future. Because, of course, when the economy increases, more jobs are created, and especially for young people, I think that really is the key challenge. So if you're setting up your own company or going out for a job, you're not looking at whether it's a woman boss or a male boss. You just look at where you get the best high standard quality of work, opportunities, and challenges. And I think that really is the way ahead.
With that, I'd like to thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen,
thank
to
you for
the audience. Thank you very much for joining us today. This will be put on YouTube, so I hope you will get an opportunity to listen to Sonia Singh. Again, thank you very much for joining me today at the Kautilya School, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Goodbye now.
Thank you very much, Anita, and thank you to the Kautilya School for inviting me. Thank you.
Pleasure to have you with us. Goodbye now.